Greetings from Elite English Academy. Welcome to this TRB English Polytechnic Lecturer Exam Preparation Series 2020. In this video, I am going to discuss Biographia Literaria by S.T. Coleridge, Chapter 14. Biographia Literaria by Coleridge is one of the path-breaking works in the history of English language and literature, because this is the work in a very minute way discusses the role of a poet, role of a poetry, how a poetry should be written, and how a poem should be analyzed. So all these details are meticulously presented by Coleridge. In this video, I am going to discuss the 14th chapter. Originally, the book consists of 22 chapters. First, the book was published in 1817, though Coleridge completed the work in 1815. Because of the revision and addition, it took 2 more years for publication. What does he say in chapter 14? So earlier, Coleridge and Wordsworth, they were neighbors. Together, they wrote lyrical ballads. When lyrical ballad was published for the second time in 1800, Wordsworth wrote lyrical ballads introduction, preface to lyrical ballads, in which he was talking about important aspects of the language of poetry, the theme of poetry, how the things should be taken from ordinary life, language of ordinary life, all these things he discussed. So here Coleridge recalls those incidents. So when they were neighbors, the poet says, Coleridge says, they were discussing the important aspects of poetry. At that time, they concluded there are two cardinal points of poetry. First, the power of exciting the sympathy of the reader by a faithful adherence to the truth of nature. So here, the poet concludes that the poetry has the power of exciting sympathy in the minds of the readers, but at the same time, that should be created only with the faithful adherence to the truth of nature. So nature, the poetry should be written that goes with nature, but at the same time that should arise the enthusiasm, sympathy, feelings at the heart of the people, especially readers. Important point 2. The power of giving the interest of novelty by the modifying colors of imagination. So here the poetry should be something new, novelty. But how the novelty should be achieved? That is by the modifying colors of imagination. See, the incidents of ordinary life, the incidents faced by the ordinary people should be taken, but at the same time, that ordinariness should be made extraordinary by modifying colors of imagination. So, ordinary things should be made extraordinary by our imagination. These are the two cardinal points of poetry. Number one, poetry should create or evoke emotions, but at the same time it should go with nature. Number two, the incident should be added or colored with imagination. Based on the two cardinal points of poetry, these two poets, Wordsworth and Coleridge, took two important decisions. Decision number one, I have given the textual line from the book, so just try to get the point. A series of poems might be composed of two sorts. So they decide to write poems in two types. First, in one, the incidents and agents were to be, in part at least, supernatural. So one should be in the line of supernatural elements. Supernatural, something above nature, something we cannot understand, something which is not practical. So, in part at least supernatural. And the excellence aimed at was to consist in the interesting of the affections by the dramatic truth of such emotions. But at the same time, it should consist of the dramatic truth of such emotions. Please make a difference here. Anything that is supernatural is not real. not truth. But at the same time, these two poets try to combine the supernatural element with some dramatic truth. That's how they can evoke some emotions, as would naturally accompany such situations, supposing them real. So here it is like almost a magical realism. The poets try to combine reality and supernatural elements. When something is presented in the form of the poetry, which is about supernatural element, when a reader reads, that should appear as real. So that is the point. So decision number one, writing poetry of supernatural elements, but it should appear real. That is the gist of decision one. Decision two, the theme of the subjects or the subjects of the poetry were to be chosen from ordinary life. Please make a note of it. The subject matter should be taken from ordinary life. Ordinary life means ordinary lives of people like shepherds and other workers. Then, the characters and incidents were to be such as would be found in every village and its vicinity. So, the incidents chosen for the description in the poetry, that such incidents should be found in all types of villages. So anywhere in the world, if you go to a village, such incidents should be common. Right. Then where there is a meditative and feeling mind to seek after them or to notice them when they present themselves. At the same time, when ordinary lives are presented in the poetry, the meditative reader, that is, a reader should think of it and should be urged to go to the village and see the or experience the things in person. I hope you get the point. See, decision number two, the theme should be taken from ordinary life. The ordinary life should be found in every village across the world, right? At the same time, when one reader happens to read these ordinary incidents in the poem, that should force him to go and experience the same thing in any of the villages in the world. So that's why he says, a feeling mind to seek after them, the same experience to relive or to notice them, at least to see when they present themselves in the form of poetry. So in this idea only the plan of lyrical ballads originated. So now to recall the thing, Wordsworth and Coleridge were friends, they were neighbors. They were discussing the important aspects of poetry. As a result, they decided to write lyrical ballads. First, they published lyrical ballads in 1798 without introduction. In 1800, the republication had preface to lyrical ballads that was written by Wordsworth himself. Another fact is, as a neighbor, as a friend, Coleridge insisted Wordsworth to write the introduction. The original plan is he wanted to write, but he had all the ideas and he gave it to Wordsworth, and combining those things, Wordsworth wrote it. The very interesting aspect is in Biographia Literaria, while discussing all the points of poetry, the introduction preface to lyrical ballads, Coleridge is contradicting the ideas of Wordsworth. So that is the important thing that we are going to discuss in the rest of the discussion. So now the plan, how they are dividing. So earlier we said, so two sets has to be written. One is supernatural, another one is ordinary and real. So now what should be the role of Coleridge? The plan was Coleridge should be directed to persons and characters supernatural or at least romantic, yet so as to transfer from our inward nature a human interest and a semblance of truth sufficient to produce for these shadows of imagination that willing suspension of disbelief for the moment which constitute poetic faith. So, so many important phrases are here. So the plan is, let me sum up here. Coleridge should touch the theme of supernatural elements. It should be supernatural, or at least romantic, but at the same time to transfer from our inward nature a human interest and a semblance of truth. So the supernatural element should originate from the inward nature of human beings, but at the same time it should have truth. That is more important. So repeatedly I am insisting that supernatural element is different from truth. But the idea of these two poets is they have to touch supernatural element, but at the same time that should appear as true, sufficient to produce for these shadows of imagination. So it has to trigger the imagination, that willing suspension of disbelief for the moment. So please note down this particular line. So the supernatural element to create imagination in the mind of the readers. So that is called willing suspension of disbelief for the moment. For example, he wrote the rhyme of the ancient mariner. The rhyme of the ancient mariner you should have studied. So in different syllabus you have studied that, right? So there, whenever the albatross comes, so there is a kind of natural element. But whenever the strange noise is heard, so the ghost ship appears, there is supernatural element. But at the same time, suddenly the human element also comes. So when we read Rime of the Ancient Mariner, so when we find out that all the 200 men are dead, so just we believe that, we start believing that it is the power of the language of Coleridge that we are forced to believe that supernatural elements. So this idea is called as willing suspension of disbelief for the moment. But later we just realize, no, it is just not real, it is a supernatural element. So the assignment to Coleridge is to write a set of poetry supernatural elements, at least romantic, but it has to start from inward nature of human beings, but at the same time it should have some truth. As a result, the poetry should create willing suspension of disbelief for a moment on the part of the learners, which constitute poetic faith. So willing suspension of disbelief is called as poetic faith. So the example as given, the rhyme of the ancient mariner. Right. So according to the plan, what is the role of Mr. Wordsworth? What should be his poetry? So earlier we said one is supernatural element poetry, another one is from nature and from ordinary life. Now what is the exact role of Mr. Wordsworth? I would like to mention that whenever Wordsworth is referred in this particular work, Coleridge treats him with respect. He always adds the salutation, Mr. Mr. Wordsworth. Wordsworth was to propose to himself as his object to give the charm of novelty to things of every day and to excite a feeling analogous to the supernatural by awakening the mind's attention to the lethargy of custom and directing it to the loveliness and the wonders of the world before us in an inexhaustible treasure, but for which, in consequence of the film of familiarity and selfish solitude, we have eyes yet see not, ears that hear not, and hearts that neither feel nor understand. So, in this part, Coleridge becomes very poetic. So, when he describes the role of Wordsworth, as per the plan, he has to write poetry. Wordsworth has to write poetry based on the ordinary life. So let me explain line by line. So Wordsworth was to propose to himself as his object to give the charm of novelty to things every day. So first things, so everyday life is ordinary to everyone. But at the same time, his job is finding the novelty, finding the newness in everyday's life, number one. And to excite a feeling analogous to the supernatural, to create a feeling that is just opposite to the supernatural. Supernatural, something that is which we cannot comprehend. Whereas this one natural feeling is familiar, by awakening the mind's attention to the lethargy of custom. So here, in ordinary life, we ignore what is happening around us. The idea of Wordsworth's poetry should be he has to bring the attention of the people to the everyday custom, that is lethargy of custom, and directing it to the loveliness and the wonders of the world before us. By drawing the attention of the ordinary people to the ordinary things around us, so he has to present the loveliness and wonders of the world. So Coleridge find the people do not enjoy what is going on around them. So Wordsworth's poetry should display the wonders of ordinary life, an inexhaustible treasure. So the ordinary life has got inexhaustible, so much of treasure that cannot be used, that cannot be exhausted at all. So much, the once you take a treasure from ordinary life, it will be replenished immediately. But for which, in consequence of the film of familiarity and selfish solitude, we have eyes, you see not. So how people are living in this world. So there is, we have eyes, but we see not. We have ears, but hear not. And we have hearts that neither feel nor understand. So these are the things of ordinary people. See, we have eyes, we have heart, we have ears, but we do not listen to, we do not feel, we do not see the beauty of nature. So to conclude, Mr. Wordsworth's poetry should take things from ordinary life, use language from ordinary life, and display the everyday wonders to the people by calling the attention of the people around. So he should cater to the needs of, or he should just categorically present the beauty of ordinary life to every person through his poetry. So now the plan is made. So what is the plan? Coleridge should write poetry of supernatural elements. Mr. Wordsworth should write poetry of nature and ordinary life. So in the preface to the second edition, Wordsworth says like this. So please remember, first publication of lyrical ballads took place in 1798, which did not have any preface. It was the collection of poetry both by Wordsworth and Coleridge. Whereas in the second edition, which was published in 1800, preface was attached. This preface was written by Wordsworth, but Coleridge asked him to write the preface. So now coming to the point. In the second edition of Lyrical Ballads, Wordsworth says like this: the language of real life was the only suitable language for all kind of poetry, and he rejected as vicious and indefensible all kind of poetry, all phrases and forms of style that were not included in that language. See, according to Wordsworth, as he mentioned in Lyrical Ballads, the language of poetry should be the language of real life. Then what happened at the time of publication of Lyrical Ballads? Critics discovered meanness of language and inanity of thought. Inanity means trivial. So when Wordsworth said theme can be ordinary, language can also be from ordinary people's life. But critics thought it is the meanness, so that is very ordinary, mean, very, very low level. Meanness of language. So they found Wordsworth language as mean and inanity. Inanity means trivial of thought. Trivial thought presented in trivial language. So that's how the writers, critics concluded regarding the poetry of Wordsworth. Coleridge does not agree with several parts of the preface, but at the same time he defends Wordsworth. Next, we are going to discuss Coleridge's views on poem and poetry. In our day-to-day life, we use poem and poetry in a synonymous way. So poem means a singular poem, poetry the collection of poem, Similarly, we use it. But at the same time, there is a key difference between poem and poetry. Poetry means the process of writing a poetry, like collection of material, writing the first draft, redefining it like that. So the process of writing a poem is called as poetry. Whereas poem means the end product, that is individual poem, the work of art. So now let me revise. Poem means an individual poem, a work of art. Poetry means the process of writing that poem. Now let's discuss. A poem contains the same elements as a prose composition. See, he's talking about the prose and poetry. So a poem as well as the poetry, a poem as well as prose has got the same elements. It has got words, it has got sentences. The difference therefore must consist in a different combination of them in consequence of a different object being proposed. So what is the difference between prose and poetry? The poetry and prose have the same content, same words, but the metrical arrangement is different. How poetry is presented is different. In Tamil, there is a beautiful definition for this. எழுத்துக்கள் நடந்து வந்தால் அது உரைநடை, அதுவே நடனமாடி வந்தால் அது கவிதை. Similarly, the contents are same for both poetry and prose, but at the same time, in poetry, the words are arranged in a better way so that the music is produced and the rhyme, everything comes. Then, according to the difference of the object, it will be the difference of the combination. So the main difference will be based on the combination of words. The object may be merely to facilitate the recollection of any given facts or observations by artificial arrangement. One more thing the poet wants, there is a danger that it will be organized in such a way it will be artificial. In prose it will be natural, but at the same time in poetry it will be artificial, but it will create music. The composition will be a poem merely because it is distinguished from prose by meter or by rhyme or both by conjointly. So what is the main difference between a poetry and prose? So everything is same, but at the same time the composition will be a poem. Composition means how it is organized. It is merely because it is distinguished from prose by meter will be different, rhyme will be there, or both meter and rhyme will be there. So this is the most important difference between prose and poetry. To recall, let me sum up that. So poem and poetry. Poem is the finished product, the individual poem, work of art. Poetry, the process of writing it. So now, the previous point continues. The immediate end of composition may be truth or pleasure. So when we write a poem, the immediate objective is truth, giving the truth or finding the truth or finding happiness. Then pleasure, and that of the highest and most permanent kind, may result from the attainment of the end, but it is not itself the immediate end. See, everyone wants to have pleasure by reading a poetry, by reading a poem. But at the same time, it cannot be achieved immediately. So go through the point again. Pleasure, and that of the highest and most permanent kind, may result from the attainment of the end. Attainment of the end. So once a poem is thoroughly understood, then pleasure may be there. But at the same time, but it is not itself the immediate end. Just by reading poem, you cannot get pleasure. In other words, the communication of pleasure may be the immediate purpose. And though truth, either moral or intellectual, ought to be the ultimate end, yet this will distinguish the character of the author, not the class to which the work belongs. So this is another complex point presented by Coleridge. See, a writer should evoke both morality, moral values, so that is the truth, and pleasure. So the immediate end of reading a poem may be pleasure, but at the same time, that pleasure should lead to the discovery of truth and ensuring moral and intellectual values. I hope you get the 2 points very clear. So the pleasure, when you read a poem, immediately you have to get pleasure, otherwise people won't read. But at the same time, to get pleasure, you have to go for a long way. So he contradicts himself in the same point. Second, any communication subjective is giving pleasure, but an immediate purpose. But at the same time, towards the end, it should lead to moral discovery and intellectual uprightness. But at the same time, it should be leading a reader to truth. So giving the truth should be the ultimate aim of a poem. Next, he's talking something about a proper poem. A proper poem is one whose parts mutually support and explain each other. For example, a poem may contain 14 lines. The poem will be written on a central theme. A sonnet may contain 14 lines. So individually, every line should contribute towards the development of the central theme. Then he says, a series of striking lines or distiches which make a separate whole instead of a harmonizing part cannot be called a poem. So here he says what is not a poem. A series of striking lines or distiches which makes a separate whole. See, some people have the poetic quality. Even when they write prose, it will look like poetry. So the poet says simply because someone is writing in beautiful language, that need not be a poetry. But it should be harmonized properly. So now link the second point with the previous point. So every line of a poem should contribute to the central theme. If all lines are not contributing to the central theme, if some lines are more beautiful with poetic quality, that is not a poem. So what is a poem? A poem that contributes, or every line that contributes to the central theme. What is not a poem? A poem with some striking lines but without harmony, then that is not a poem. Then the reader should be carried forward not merely or chiefly by the mechanical impulse of curiosity or by a restless desire to arrive at the final solution, but by the pleasurable activity of mind excited by the attraction of the journey itself. So this is another. So the reader should be carried forward not because of mechanical impulse or restlessness or to the final solution, but by the pleasurable activity of mind excited by the attractions of the journey. So let me sum up this point. Here, the objective of reading a poem is finding the truth, or the objective of writing a poem is giving the truth. But the finding the truth should not be a mechanical activity. It should be a pleasurable activity. I hope you get the point. Just let's give assignments to two persons. The theme is nature. One person should write an essay on nature. Another person should write a poem on nature. Both are given 2 pages limit. Right? Both of them read. See, if you read the prose, what will happen? You will get more beautiful ideas. Yes, sufficient. So here, when the person who is submitting the poem, he also will come out with beautiful ideas. But both of them have given the ideas, but which will be the pleasurable activity? reading prose or poetry? By reading both, we get the content. I hope you get the point. But at the same time, one will be a boring activity and another one will be a pleasurable activity. So this is the idea of Wordsworth. See, by reading the poem, you should get pleasure, but it should not end with pleasure. It should go, or it should lead you to discover the truth. Then he is discussing the qualities and functions of a poet. The poet, described in ideal perfection, brings the whole soul of man into activity. So a poet activates the soul of a man. That is the simple point. How? How does he do it? With a subordination of its faculties to each other according to their relative worth and dignity. So here the poet makes an individual understand the different faculties different faculties here, branches of knowledge to each other according to their relative worth and dignity. So what is the role of the poet? The poet activates the mind of the learner, reader, but at the same time it helps the reader to realize the real purpose of different knowledges that he possesses. The poet diffuses a tone and spirit of unity that blends and fuses each into each. Look at the beautiful phrase. He diffuses to tone and spirit of unity that blends and fuses each into each by the synthetic and magical power of imagination. So imagination combines different knowledges. Imagination fuses, joins the different knowledges in such a way so that will lead to the discovery of truth in a poem. So the role of the poet, it is still a few more points are there. The role of the poet is he should activate the mind of the people and he should bring the unity of different knowledges. So the point of functions of a poet continues. This power of being a poet, this power reveals itself in the balance or reconcilement of opposite or discordant. So the poetry has the power of combining two opposite things. The poet has the power of bringing two opposite things together. So like he just explained, the rest of the things are contributing to this point. So that is how opposite things become one in poem. Of sameness with difference. He finds sameness in different things. Of the general with the concrete. The poet finds concrete thing in general. The idea with the image. So image comes from idea. He sees both of them as single. The individual with the representative. The sense of novelty and freshness with old and familiar objects. So he has the power of combining the old thing and new thing. A more than usual state of emotion with more than usual order. Normally, an emotional thing will not find any order. Whereas the poet is able to present the most emotional thing in proper order. Judgment ever awake and steady self-possession with enthusiasm and feeling profound or vehement. And while it blends, so here the poetic power blends and harmonizes the natural and the artificial, still subordinates art to nature. So, but at the same time, still subordinates art to nature. This is one of the very important aspects of the poetic theory of Wordsworth. What is, see, poetry or poem should be on nature, but poetry is subordinate to nature. Who is superior, nature or poetry? Only nature is superior. Still subordinates art to nature, the manner to the matter. So what is more important in poetry, the subject matter or how it is presented? The subject matter is important, and our admiration of the poet to our sympathy with the poetry, and our admiration of the poet to the sympathy with the poetry. What should be praised? The poet or the poetry? But the poetry. So this is the way how Wordsworth presents the different aspects of poetic power. So to conclude this particular part, the poet has the power of the poet has the power of combining different things into one, or seeing wholeness in difference, seeing unity in disorient things. So with this, the discussion on the 14th chapter gets over. Dear friends, with this, the discussion on Coleridge's Biographia Literaria chapter 14 is over. The detailed discussion of all the other chapters are available in the main course. I hope the video is useful to you. If you like the video, like and share among your friends. Thank you. See you.